My sense is if the bloody laptop story hadn't been suppressed, the election wouldn't have gone the way it went, because it was a pretty narrow margin, and this is a pretty vicious story. And so the fact that the FBI conspired with Facebook and Twitter to collapse this story, to limit its reach, and then to attribute it to Russian disinformation, and then to have the security community come out. Now, you detail this in your book too. There's dozens of people from the security and intelligence community that come out and say, oh, this is definitely Russian disinformation. And one of the things you point out in your book is they had absolutely no evidence whatsoever to be making that claim. And so now all of a sudden your story disappears and the New York Post is off Twitter, and it's 3 weeks before the election, and it's a very narrow election, and it turns out that Biden wins. It's like, well, to call that a scandal is to say almost nothing. It's no wonder that Trump's story that the election was stolen resonates with his base, even if it's not stolen in the detailed way that he describes. There's certainly something unbelievably rotten going on at the highest possible levels of essentially fascist collusion, right? Government, the presidency, the White House itself, the FBI, the CIA, Facebook, and Twitter, all colluding to take down the New York Post for reporting on the corruption of Hunter Biden. Yeah, you'd kind of think that would be front page story on a place like the New York Times, for example, if it wasn't corrupt beyond comprehension.
Yeah, not just corrupt, but I also wonder, since I've been investigating this story, I see, the intelligence community as so embedded in social media, in Facebook and Twitter, and manipulating behind the scenes and censoring. It's not just the Twitter files, it's this incredible court case called Missouri versus Biden, where the charge is that, and a judge actually did find that the Biden administration is appealing that, but found that the Biden administration, the government, was putting enormous pressure on these social media companies to censor anything that went against their narrative. I mean, whether it was on COVID, on vaccines, on the Ukraine war, memes about Jill Biden, anything that was detrimental to the government was verboten. And the government was holding over these social media companies the threat that the Republicans are into as well, that ought to be followed through on, actually, that they would break them up and use Section 230, which allows them to escape the normal legal constraints that a normal publisher like the New York Post has. But so that was the threat hanging over them. And
so let's delve into that for a second. Okay, so now we have a situation where the president's office itself has been found in violation of the First Amendment, direct violation of the First Amendment. It's not some accidental violation. It's a programmatic, repeated violation of the First Amendment. And the journalists, let's say at the New York Times, or at CNN for that matter, MSNBC, aren't smart enough to understand that a direct assault on the First Amendment actually, well, let's say, threatens their livelihood insofar as they're actually acting as journalists. So how do you make sense out of the FBI, CIA collusion with the White House? Why the hell would they do that? And then what's going on with the journalists? Like, this is something that just makes my jaw drop. It's like, of all the things that you would think would light a fire underneath journalists, it would be the assault by politicians on the First Amendment. So, like, what the hell? Why is this happening?
Well, there's two things there. So on the journalism, my feeling is that if the social media companies are basically controlled by intelligence operatives, so too must be the New York Times and the Washington Post, the so-called prestige brands. They wouldn't bother with the New York Post, but the New York Times, for instance, is an incredibly powerful entity. It dictates, it sets the agenda for newsrooms across the world. I've worked in Australia as a journalist and in Britain, and the New York Times is incredibly influential. And it's sort of all the news that's fit to print. If it's in the New York Times, you can take it to the bank. That has been its brand. And I've just seen through the Russia collusion stories and the stories that I have done deep dives on, and particularly the laptop story, that they peddle lies, outright lies. and the Washington Post as well. They do fact checking. You know, when you actually go back and look, the Shokin thing, I know I spent a long time talking about it, but there is layer upon layer of so many lies, and it's not just lies, it's documents disappeared internationally. It's an operation. It's not just journalists being sloppy or one corrupt journalist. This is a concerted operation, the likes of which you would get from, spies. So I don't know exactly how it works, but a rule of thumb that someone told me is the State Department these days is about 50% CIA. So, and and there's various ways you can tell who's CIA and who isn't and these spies operate as diplomats.
So why are they so aligned? Why are they so aligned with the Biden administration? Like, I wouldn't think that necessarily that the natural allies of the security/intelligence community would necessarily be the left-wing Democrats. Like, so how do you account for that?
It's not really about that. It's about, partly it may be, but because Washington, they're all from the swamp, and in Washington, 90% of people vote Democrat. But I think it's something more, and I think this is why Trump was perceived as an existential threat. Because actually, when you look at his presidency, he just, he didn't do any, he didn't start any wars, he didn't do anything dangerous. The economy was ticking along. There was nothing outrageous he did. He really, for all his rhetoric, he was a pretty conventional conservative, apart from he didn't buy the neocon worldview, this sort of imperialist American worldview where, it's not only, in 9/11, it was, and I regret myself. I fell for all of that, and I was all rah-rah for Iraq, which I bitterly regret. And now I'm very cynical about the lies that I was told and bought then, and I hear now from the same people. And so I think that Trump just didn't buy into that whole project. It's America first. It's more the isolationist streak, and he would ask NATO, why aren't you pulling your weight? Why aren't the Europeans paying for their own military? Why are we having to be the policemen of the world? Why can't we have a decent relationship with Russia? I mean, he's just upending, decades of sort of Cold War mentality, which has never gone away.
You mean like he upended the Palestine narrative with regards to the Abraham Accords?
Exactly. Right. And all for the good, really.
Well, that was something, yes.
Fresh thinking there, and so I think that is why he's an existential threat, because those people who were the deepest of the neocon deep state really loathed him, and you see that in, the CIA letter by the 51 former intelligence officials is very instructive. That was the letter that was written just a few days after our story came out and was suppressed. And it was designed, we know, to help Joe Biden in the second debate against Donald Trump, in which obviously the laptop from hell is going to come up. And we now know, thanks to the Oversight Committee, now the Republicans are in control, that letter was organised by Mike Morell, who'd been a former acting CIA director and was on a promise to be Biden's CIA director. So he had a personal motive.
So when you say it was organised, in what way? What does that mean exactly, that letter?
What we also find is that Antony Blinken, now the Secretary of State and a member of Joe Biden's inner circle, was working for the Biden campaign. He phoned Mike Morell a day or two, or maybe the same day, Morell's vague on it, that our story came out. And Morell said, he didn't tell me to write the letter, but he would not have written the letter if he hadn't had the phone call from Antony Blinken, and if Antony Blinken hadn't sent him a USA Today story, which I have no doubt was seeded by the intelligence community, which said that the laptop was Russian disinformation. And so Mike Morell then set about getting 51 former, most of them CIA people, some like James Clapper, who's lied before Congress, not exactly an honest broker. He was also pulled in, but there were 5 former CIA directors or acting CIA directors who signed that letter. This was a heavy-duty letter, and what they said was, well, the message that it sent was that the laptop and our story, therefore, were Russian disinformation.
Right.
They wrote the letter and they try to get out of now was very weaselly. They used a language like has all the earmarks, which is a weird word, of a Russian information operation. They used the weight of their previous high careers in the CIA to basically sign, seal, and deliver this letter. And Mike Morell says in his emails to other people when he's trying to recruit them to sign the letter that he wants to get, in fact, he tells John Brennan, former CIA director under Obama, who had a lot to do with the destabilization of Ukraine. He tells John Brennan, I want to give Joe Biden a talking point at the debate, a way to
oh, how nice of him.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that struck me is so preposterous about that. So, when that broke, I thought, well, that's a lot of former intelligence officials. And, it's hard to imagine that they're all colluding. But on the other hand, why in the world would the Russians be so thrilled with Trump? I mean, you had to buy that story, right? You had to believe that Trump was somehow a natural ally of Russia and Putin. And I mean, I know that Trump got along with Putin the same way he got along with the preposterous leader of North Korea. But it certainly didn't seem to me that there was any evidence to suggest that Trump was the natural ally of Russia. And so you had to buy that to believe that the Russians would be so interested in Trump that they would go to all this work to produce this, complex form of unbelievably sophisticated disinformation in the form of a fake laptop from Hunter dropped off in some no-account place in Delaware. I mean, none of that makes any sense unless, you attribute like super spy capabilities to some genius on the Russian front, which strikes me as, somewhat preposterous. And yet, well, all 51 of these people signed this document. And so everyone
they
thought...
signed it without looking at the laptop, without asking to have a look at the hard drive, without
you and your details.
Any due diligence. I mean, they had no evidence to say this. None. And they in fact admitted in the letter, they say, from our vast experience, we've ascertained, this has the whole earmarks of a Russian information operation. So they abused their authority. They abused the trust that the American people would have in that authority.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinary to me that they haven't apologized. They've, we have tried numerous times. I've tried. I've sent emails. I've phoned. I've called their bosses. I've called the think tanks. They've the bosses of the think tanks that they're aligned to. Every which way. We've had other reporters do the same thing, and there's just nothing from them. It's just dead. One guy called David Priest, who was a CIA something or other, he went on Fox News and he said he's happy that he did it. It was the right thing to do.
By what standard? But because Trump is so evil that every possible weapon used against him is justifiable no matter what? Is that the rationale?
Well, that's the subtext. But no, he had some bogus excuse. Can't even remember. It was so flimsy. But they and I have spoken to someone who should have signed it, had the credentials to sign it, and didn't sign it because he felt that there was no basis for it. He didn't want to be involved in he just saw it as a political hit. And so that would have been, these people are very savvy. I mean, you'd expect them to be. They're high-level CIA analysts and directors. You would expect that they would sniff a rat and know that this was political. Of course they knew. But as you said, they felt there was this sort of this illness that had was afflicting the intelligence community and all the formers, which was that Trump is an existential threat.
Sure, that's right. You see that in the reaction of people like Harris, is that Trump is such a threat that no matter... See, it's so interesting to me to see this happening because it's happening on multiple fronts. Like, we're told by people continually that we face existential threats that are such that all the normal rules should be upended by moral people. And those normal rules could mean every single one of your constitutional rights, which is, of course, what happened in the COVID lockdown, which is now a disease that the doctors, according to MSNBC, are having a difficult time distinguishing from the common cold, so that's kind of a problem. And so we have emergency.
Climate change.
Well, that's the next one. That's the next one. It's like climate change is such an emergency that every right-thinking person is terrified into apocalyptic panic, and so you don't get to fly, and you don't get to have a car, and you don't get to leave your city, and you don't get to eat meat, and well, quote, we get all the power. And of course, that has nothing to do with any of this. And so, one of the things that I've come to conclude is that if you're listening to someone who says the crisis is such that your fear justifies my suspension of your civil liberties, then you're talking not to your ally in crisis and an appropriate leader, but to a tyrant in sheep's clothing. And this is exactly what's happening on the Trump front, too. It's like, oh my God, he's so dangerous, just like climate change and COVID, that anything goes no matter what, because no matter what we do on our side, and we're the good guys, it can't be nearly as bad as Trump might do at some unspecified point in the future. It's like, well, just about enough of this. I mean, the story that you unfold, and we touched on the collusion part of it here at the end. It's right again. FBI, CIA, Facebook, Twitter, conspiring with the Washington Post and the New York Times to subvert what I would say is the story of the biggest political scandal in my lifetime. Like, I was around, I was young during the Watergate hearings and the Nixon collapse, and that was nothing compared to this, as far as I can tell. First of all, it was, Nixon had his hands in a variety of relatively unseemly places, but not in as spectacularly multidimensional manner as this, especially not when you factor in the post hoc Hunter Biden collusion to silence the people who brought it to public attention. It's absolutely beyond comprehension.